Hello everyone, I'm Silent Death and welcome back to my Let's Play Space Engineers series. Sorry it has been a while since the last episode of this series. I have been and am a bit under the weather, and as this series takes the longest to produce, it is the one that tends to be cut when I am short on time. But today, we're going to make up for the delay with a pretty awesome episode. We're going to be looking at the super weapon that I unveiled a couple episodes ago. There are a few details about how the weapon works that I was not aware of when I made the previous episode, and I've also come up with a number of new torpedo designs that are significantly more advanced than the other designs that I showed in the previous episode. First off, since it does need to be said, this does still work in this version of the game. We're in 046, the September 5th update, and as you can see, it still pretty much owns asteroids. A number of people have been having trouble getting this to work in their own world. After some extensive testing, I believe I've come across the primary reason for that. Here we have 20 small pistons. They are set at a velocity of 1.1 meters per second. And at that velocity, we get the desired effect. Thus, at 22 meters per second, we get the desired effect. However, if we bump the force or the velocity up to 24 meters per second, all we get is a normal explosion. Thus, the impact velocity of the firing pin does matter. And this is probably why most people are not getting the desired effect when they try to build it themselves. Theoretically, one should be able to use the braking force of the landing gear to slow the firing pin assembly down to the desired velocity. Towards that end, I've built this thing to find the exact amount of braking force we need. Unfortunately, the results were inconsistent. And also, the braking force does not seem to be actually the braking force. As in, the piston does not, or the landing gear does not release when the force equals the braking force. The slowest I was able to slow the firing pin down was between 50 and 60 meters per second using this contraption. Of particular note is that the impact is slightly different each time. Operating under the assumption that the additional buffer, the value above the braking force, was some fixed value, and that the firing pin was simply too light, I built this with a heavier firing pin design. It's basically a firing pin with a whole bunch of heavy armor blocks slapped onto it. Unfortunately, that still did not work. Trying another method to slow down the velocity of the firing pin, I used this kind of scissors extension thing. And let's see. Don't recall if there's any buttons on this one. Unfortunately, this one also does not work. Though you do still get a slightly larger than normal explosion, about the size of that crater that you can see there. It's just not what we're looking for. Now let's move on to some things that actually do work. I've had much better luck with controlling the velocity of the torpedo itself. This is a slightly redesigned version of the thruster torpedo, except for this one uses gravity to accelerate. It's been redesigned so that the center of mass is actually in the center. And it gives us a nice big boom. One thing to note is that even though the impact velocity can only be 20 meters per second, or about 20 meters per second, this torpedo here achieves about 45 meters per second at time of impact. However, what I believe is happening is that the landing gear is set on auto lock, so the braking force is in fact slowing it down some. So that means that we can have a torpedo that moves around 45 meters per second and still achieve detonation. Another simple modification that works is replacing the reactor with the battery. A battery charged between 7 and 8.4 kilowatt hours will accelerate this particular design to the desired velocity. Of course, this only works in survival mode, as in creative mode the battery doesn't actually drain power. This particular design is really only useful for long-range bombardment of stationary targets. But it does completely destroy the ship, or at least everything that isn't heavy armor. And then .046 came out, which gave us all kinds of goodies to make our life much easier. First off, you can set the warhead, the large warhead, on a timer. In this case, we're using the default 10-second timer. And we still get our explosion. Of course, there's no guarantee that the ship you're firing at is going to have antennas or beacons, so you may not know the range. For that, there is the new sensor block. In the front, we have the sensor set to pretty much maximum range, detect large ships, and its action is to detonate the warhead. In the back, we have a sort of safety sensor, if I can find it. And this particular sensor is also set to detect large ships, but it only extends in the rear of the ship. And its actions are, when it leaves, it turns the safety off. So when you leave the launch platform, the safety gets turned off, which prevents any kind of accidental detonation. Now, where was that button? Not only does this make it easier for you to set up the explosion, but it also means that you don't have to directly impact the target. You can combine the sensors with the gravity launch version to get a torpedo that is launched at the maximum velocity. And that completely gets the ship, even though it didn't require a direct impact. This particular design is far better than the designs mentioned in the other episode, or the impact designs. The problem with the impact designs is that the braking force of the firing pin needs to be so low that any kind of impact will knock loose the firing pin and cause the torpedo to detonate before it reaches the target. This can be accomplished with a single hit from a missile, or just any kind of impact of a floating object. However, by using either timers or sensors, you can set the braking force of the firing pin to the maximum, and you won't ever have to worry about it coming loose. Additionally, these sensors allow an additional safety factor by not arming the torpedo until after it has left the ship, or whatever launch platform you choose to use. There is one more design. And now for the pièce de résistance. We have a military 3 ship, which is running away. Naturally, we're not going to let it get away, so we will launch our torpedo after it. Unfortunately, it looks like we're going to just miss it. But wait! The torpedo is turning around! And bye-bye military 3 ship. This particular design is merely a proof of concept of the primitive guidance system, and while the guidance system is primitive, it is still far better than no guidance system at all. I will mention a few things you would need to change to make this a truly battle-worthy design. But first, let's go over how this works. First off, we have the standard launch platform sensor. However, instead of turning off the safety of the warhead, it turns on the rotors. We rely on a different method for the safety. The warhead is in fact armed with the safety off. The rotors are set at a minimum angle of 0 degrees and a maximum angle of 90 degrees. 1.44 RPM. At the end of each rudder arm is a sensor set to detect large ships. And when a large ship enters the range, it turns on the gyroscope, and when the large ship leaves the range, it turns off the gyroscope. Gyroscope it is hooked to is the one at the other end of that sensor's rudder arm. And these gyroscopes are set to roll over or just override to turn the torpedo in the appropriate direction. Those sensors are at this moment off. Here we have another sensor. It's set to detect this rudder arm so that when this rudder arm is fully turned, it'll move out of the sensor field. At that point, this will turn on all the other sensors, which is the sensors at the ends of the rudder arm, as well as the main detonation sensor. And that's how we're making this weapon safe. To make this actually battle-worthy, you would need, first off, a much higher acceleration and a much greater turn rate. Given that we were only going after something relatively slow as the military 3 ship, that didn't matter for that demonstration. But if you're going after something much faster and more nimble, you would definitely want something more maneuverable. The higher acceleration will allow it to basically reverse course faster and also close quickly if it slightly overshoots and it wants to turn into its target. While the turn rate will make that turning into its target much faster, so that if it is going much faster than its target, it doesn't overshoot it. Also, you would want the rudder arms to be considerably longer. For this particular design, I only have the detonation sensor set to half its normal maximum range. You could also use pistons along the rotor arm if you were willing to gamble on them not falling apart every time someone looked at them hard. That is up to you. And of course, the thrusters on the side are merely to keep the thing from spinning out while the arms are moving. And you do need to keep these sensors off until the arms are fully turned. Otherwise, the sensor will detect the other rudder arms. That's because, actually I guess we can't see it until after we turn them on. That's because the back extend cannot be 0. So it does extend back a little bit. We will be exploring this concept a little bit more in a future episode. Right now it's somewhat limited due to the limited range of the sensor, but as was mentioned in the patch notes, this is not the final version of the sensor. There will be more features added to the sensor as more patches are released, and once a more complete version of the sensor is released, we will look at some more features or more applications of this particular method. Some people have complained that I have not built a ship to launch torpedoes, which just goes to show you can't please everyone. I might do that in a future episode, but not this episode. this is going to, in fact, be the end of this episode. Like if you like. Subscribe if you're not. Leave a comment if you have anything to say. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time!